folks, first of all, want to do a little shout out and thank everyone for taking the time this morning to dial in. So for those that aren't aware, I'm physically located in Austin, Texas. So bear in mind, in network terms, we'll have a little bit of latency on the network of about 16 hours. So any reference to good evening or this time at night or, my stomach growling because it's dinner time, simply fast forward to 16 hours. That will transcribe into loosely Australian terms of breakfast and morning and, beginning of your day. So with that formality out of the way, Sandy, Mark, and the team at Agilient, thank you very much for the time. And again, to the folks that have decided to join in this morning, I appreciate you sitting in. So we have about 30 minutes to talk and unpack quite a bit of stuff. So we'll just start with the beginning. So kind of give you a little bit about myself, which will help inform the lens by which I approach the topic. It'll help inform and give you a bit of context of how Jack sees the world and frames the problem space, as it were. And more importantly, the goal here is, as we get into this conversation, and it is really a conversation, if I do my job right, I'm going to tee up enough conversational points so that for the other half of this, there'll be some good dialogue back and forth and some good questions. So really my point here is to kind of stretch the mind, get us going, through some thought exercises, some academic discussions, if you will, of the realm of the possible based on current real world events. And then more importantly, just get you excited enough about the fact of what's going on and what we can do to fix the current problems that we have to kind of really have an interesting conversation. So with that said, there are 4 things I want to talk about today, or let's just say 4 bins, if you will. One is this topic of VPNs, virtual private networks, current issues with those, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The second thing I'd like to talk about is, there's really no other way to say this, right? But it's the remote workforce situation we currently find ourselves in. What is that? We're going to unpack that a bit. I'm going to season and flavor that with season to taste, if you will, with the current threat landscape. What it is, how it's changed, what's currently going on with it, and what we can expect in the future. And that, as Mark said, is predicated on my background in the military as well as my current global role with Unisys. So this will not be a specific to the APAC region, specific to Australia specifically. This is more of a global conversation. And I would look to you, because you're really on the front lines there in the region, to kind of bring up specific issues to the region during the question and answer period. Then lastly, what I'd like to do is tease up and offer some lessons learned and some thought leadership on what right looks like. How can we actually tackle the first 3 things in a, get it out of the academic discussion, get it more into a practical execution. Who's doing it right, what does right look like, and how can you do the same thing? So that's kind of where we're going to go with the conversation. So put on your seatbelts, relax, enjoy the conversation, and let's kind of get started here. So fast and furious, who is Jack and why did you take some time out of your busy schedules to sit down and listen to this knucklehead from Austin, Texas? Well, I will tell you I'm not from Texas. I'm here because the taxes are nice, I don't have to pay a lot of taxes, and the weather is absolutely fantastic. In fact, it's probably the closest thing to the Gold Coast that we have here in the United States. So let's just get that out of the way. I spent probably about 25 years of my life, actually my entire adult life, was spent in service to the U.S. government. My role was to serve as what we refer to now as a cyber warfare officer. What that really means is that my job was to seek out adversary networks anywhere on the face of the earth, and either through remote access, which is the most preferred way of doing things, because everybody likes to sit behind a computer where it's safe and warm and cozy, but sometimes through something called what we refer to as KNO operations, close access network operations. That's when you sometimes have to just get out of the office and actually go and get up close and personal with the target network. And that network could be personal, that network could be human, that network could be virtual, it doesn't matter, it's a network, right? And all networks at some form or fashion, at some juncture, are all interconnected. So in a nutshell, that's it. My role was exploitation. Figure out a way to build what we refer to as a pathway to defeat, to get from point A to point B, build the hook, and build the, let's just say, the mechanisms in order to do things on behalf of the U.S. government. In unclassified open source intelligence terms, that's referred to as the Large Signals Intelligence or SIGINT apparatus. So that's it. In a nutshell, my role was to be the guy on the ground to enable that larger SIGINT enterprise. We did that for a lot of good things, a lot of good reasons. And what's interesting enough to this conversation, and I was talking to Mark and Sandy last week about this, Australia specifically is near and dear to my heart. I know APAC's a big region, but Australia in particular is near and dear to my heart because my final assignment in the U.S. government, and again, this is all unclassified open source stuff, was working, actually leading a joint, what's referred to as a Five Eyes element, right? So that's, a group of countries that are, close personal relationship, habitual working relationship in the intelligence circles. And Australia, the ASD, Australia Cygnus Directorate, was part of that. So got a very good working knowledge of you guys, and spent the last tour, if you will, the last 6 months of my life of a 25-year career actually working with partners from ASD, doing some good things to some bad people. So very good times. Now, having said that, that background of exploitation worldwide gave me a unique lens, if you will, into the way folks on the other side of the fence present security. When folks use words like perimeter, when folks use words like hardware, when they use words like data, I have a certain way of looking at that, right? Some would call it a piratical, like the pirate flag, right? Always looking for the angle, always looking for the way in. But with that, I left the military in 2015 and joined Unisys. As Mark said, my role is cybersecurity strategist and a technology evangelist. So that role is to go around the world and actually do two things: help tune and optimize what Unisys does for our clients and customers. But then there's this also underlying current that most people aren't aware of, and that is to see what's going on out there in the wild, bring that back into Unisys so that we can also tune and optimize our solutions so that we can iterate and spin faster to keep pace with the current threat environments. Now, having said that, got that out of the way. That's why I'm here. That's what I'm here to talk to you about. Now, what does that mean for you folks? Well, let me start by telling a little bit of a story. Back in 2006, this is pre-AWS, pre-cloud. So if you guys are all familiar, and I know you guys and girls are all familiar with the cloud, and we all talk about AWS and Azure and Google and everything else, right? But if we step back into the hot tub time machine and go way back to about 2003, there were some white papers being circulated about this thing called shared common infrastructure and distributed networks and databases, and basically using other people's things to offload your stuff, right? This was the beginning of the cloud conversation. Well, prior to that, the US government, through no fault of its own, entered into a little thing I like to call the global war on terror. And we came up against a very vexing problem. Up until then, we had purpose-built networks that allowed us to talk at multiple levels of sensitivity on closed networks to anybody that we needed to. We controlled the network, we controlled the pipes, we controlled the plumbing, we controlled the infrastructure, and we controlled the physical points where all of those people plugged and played. Life was good. It was costly and it was complex to manage, but governments use people's money, taxes, right? So money was not an object, so life was good. When the global war on terrorism kicked off, we were presented with a very unique problem that we had never faced before. That problem is a globally distributed, dynamic, remote, expeditionary in nature, or what we would call today, remote workforce. That is to say, we had guys and girls going all over the world and popping up on the shared common infrastructure known as the internet, right? Basically any mechanism that would allow TCP IP traffic to go back and forth. So this could be undersea cables, satellite shots, GSM, you name it. If it was running TCP IP, our guys and girls all over the world were popping up, and they popped up in such a way that we needed to enable them to have very sensitive conversations so that these analysts could share information, they could go out and find things, they could share information, and then dynamically scale this thing. But then more importantly, they would disappear. So if you think about that problem, right? you can't use hardware to do this, right? The traditional method of putting hardware onto a plane and flying it from point A to point B and then standing up that end or that node of the network to connect the dots, we couldn't do that. So we had to think through this problem. So I tell you that to say that since about 2006, the US government has been trying to figure out how to do this on the world's largest network owner on the face of the earth. That's the US government. The US government owns the largest network on the face of the earth. And we do that leveraging the largest infrastructure on the face of the earth, which is the internet, also created by the US government, right? So in a way, we created our own problem, right? So the issue is, man, how can we do this? So I say that to say this: we have this remote workforce enablement problem that we're in right now. This is not new, right? Everyone's acting like this is a new problem. This is something new, and that we've got to rush to figure out how to do this. Well, I'm here to tell you that other people have figured this out and have cracked the code. Now, let's slide right into because we don't have much time. Let's slide right into VPNs. I will tell you the answer is not VPNs, right? So here's the thing. Folks all know VPNs were designed to do one thing. They were designed to be a point of entrance into a perimeter that you controlled, right? So that way, say maybe 5 to 10% of your workforce on Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, they could go. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, right? This is not new to anybody. But what is new is now that same infrastructure that was purposely built to handle maybe 5 to 10% of your load Monday through Friday, right, through the hours of 9 to 5, is now being asked to basically sustain the entire business. So maybe 5,000 people hitting that VPN. Now you have 20,000 people hitting that VPN. And oh, by the way, if it's a globally distributed workforce on multiple regions, now it's 24/7, every day of the week, all hours, and that VPN cannot come down because it is the single door into that network. Now, introduce that problem set. So we have a scaling issue, right? VPNs are being asked to scale and they can't scale. Now, add into that, take 2 months ago when NSA said, we have a critical vulnerability report. We're going to release that out to the wild. Citrix, it's got a problem. Pulse Secure, it's got a problem. Basically, all the major providers of VPNs, you have a problem. You need to fix it right now. Well, how do you fix things? You got to turn it off. You got to apply the patch. Or you can elect the hot patch, which, by the way, if you really want to live wild and loose, we can talk about hot patching on the fly while you're live. But most organizations bring it down, throw the patch out, and then they bring it back up, and that application is then tested to make sure it works and it doesn't break, and then they turn it back on live. You guys all know that. You can't do that with a VPN today. So during the remote workforce crisis, you've got a scaling issue. Now we've got vulnerability issues because known vulnerabilities cannot be patched because you can't bring the system down, the VPN down to fix it, right? On top of that, we're not even talking about the actual, and I apologize to anybody that's on this line right now that actually is a VPN, seller, reseller, or a VPN, company. The fact is VPNs are not designed to be security devices, plain and simple, right? Yes, they do provide a layer of security, right? They do provide part of a conversation of security, but they are not designed to be the end-all be-all to security. They run at AES-256, yes. They provide something akin to TLS and secure sockets, which is what normal web traffic does. But folks, you all know that is susceptible and vulnerable to more nuanced attacks. You can bust that. The other thing is, in my old job, we used to jokingly refer to VPNs as vulnerability aggregators, which means that if I found the VPN and I popped the VPN, which is relatively, it's not that hard to do, right? If you know what you're doing, with the right tools, you can pop a VPN. But once you pop the VPN, you've effectively dropped the drawbridge. You are now inside of the network, the target network. And that was a great thing for us to do. We enjoyed it. It made our life easy. So that's an easy, so now we've got scaling, we've got vulnerability issues. Now we've got cost, right? Because now organizations are having to throw money to try and build out infrastructure, i.e. VPNs and switches and everything else like that, to increase the load bearing capacity of that point of entrance, right? So they're not fixing the complexity issue. They're not fixing the cost issue. They're just doing a Band-Aid issue, right? Again, we've figured this out, right? So let's get past, so VPNs are an issue right now, right? In fact, I've seen, talking to some of our clients and customers, issues where we actually have people saying, we need everyone to go off of audio, or just go to audio only. No more video, just use audio because it's a bandwidth issue on the VPN. It can't handle it during peak hours. So what you're actually asking the CISO to do is go back to the C-suite and say, we are now at the point where we are rationing work. Because if you're a selling organization, how are you selling without video? You're just talking, right? So you're just, it just becomes this self-licking ice cream cone. So that's an issue. Now the threat landscape means that everybody and his brother and sister knows one or two things is happening. They know that everyone's using VPNs, right? So they start looking at VPNs and all the vulnerabilities of VPNs. And if you know how VPN works, you know that, like for example, in Unisys, it's no secret. For example, let's say you've got BitLocker, right? You open up your work laptop, you fire up BitLocker, so now you have physical access to your computer. Well, there's a gap between the moment you have physical access and you actually initiate your VPN. Well, that gray space, that's when an adversary gets on, if it has the ability to get onto your network, right? And more importantly, if that device is at home, the same home network that's being used by your kids using Zoom for school, which is vulnerable, right? So now all this potential ingest is coming in from your home network onto your work laptop the minute you get onto your work home network. And then you're now firing up your laptop, which then drops the VPN. So now the digital salmon are able to swim into, so now we have an ingest problem into the corporation, which by the way, after the crisis of the pandemic ends, all these security teams are going to be racing to figure out what got in there and what's lurking inside their networks. So this is just a witch's brew problem, right? So wouldn't it be great if we could just get rid of the VPN conversation, right? And get back to controlling traffic. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the threat landscape, we've kind of touched on that. We could spend a few hours on that in and of itself. So that's kind of the threat landscape, the VPN issue. So let's talk about, in about the 10 minutes we got left, how we can kind of get this from an academic discussion into what right will look like. So the way the US government went about trying to fix this problem is this notion called microsegmentation, right? So for those that aren't aware of what microsegmentation is, let me back up for a second. Everybody says that they do segmentation, right? It's a best practice, right? I will tell you that when I look at most organizations today, they don't. Because what happens is there's a dynamic race condition between the network team and infrastructure team and the security team. They're on one side of the table. It's kind of like going to church, right? You're here for the wedding, right? We're all in one family, but yet you got the groom's side of the family all sitting on one side of the table or the church, and you got the bride's family is sitting on the other side, and they don't ever hang out with each other. So what happens is the network and infrastructure team are trying to connect everything. In this case, it's remote workers. Right? The security team, they're telling everybody, slow down. We need to check things. We need to verify, vet, validate, do all that good stuff, CIA, all that kind of stuff, right? Those are never paced well. They never are in sync and paced well. And they're also incentivized differently in an organization. So the culture is killing itself. What if we could get away from that conversation as well? So now we got as we say in the South here in the United States, now we got a twofer, right? What if I can increase security? What if I can get away from the VPN issue? And what if I can also bring this kind of conversation between connecting all the things and securing all the things into one conversation? So segmentation always lags behind because they're not segmenting because they're racing to connect everything. So the segmentation of network kind of loses to the conversation of connecting all the things. But segmentation is really done for network optimization and performance. It's not really done for security, right? It's a good security best practice to help with security, but it's not really designed for security. However, microsegmentation, so if you Google the term microsegmentation, that's purely designed for security. We're talking about taking the traditional notion of traditional hardware-based security and all the things you do for security on the perimeter, but imagine driving that conversation down to the actual individual IP packet itself, where the IP packet, the data packet itself, is now responsible for its own security. It's not reliant on a perimeter. Now imagine that conversation. Imagine what that just did to everything I just said. Now you no longer need to have a VPN. You no longer need to have a perimeter because the data packet itself, the data in flight, is actually providing for its own security. That was the magic concept. That was the cultural mindset change that kind of blew everybody's mind in the US government. And we said, we can actually do this because now think about it. We're talking about not AES 256 kind of conversations. We're talking about securing data packets at the exact same level that we need to ensure data integrity at the national security systems conversation in the United States, which means it's good enough for finance, it's good enough for healthcare, it's good enough for your generic workforce at the remote workforce level, right? Imagine if you could do that to the data packet, that you could let that data packet fly out of your network knowing that wherever it goes, on whatever infrastructure it goes on, the data packet is safe. That's the key. Now, That's the role of microsegmentation. Really, we're talking about hypersecure tunnels between two endpoints, and it's a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many conversation. It doesn't matter, but it is literally no longer a VPN, wall comes down, everything comes in, and then they got to go find the different applications. We're literally talking about every application and not even the application, the workload. We're talking to granular level of workload conversations being controlled so that you now scale out into hundreds, thousands of individual workloads, right? Now in Unisys, we call these things communities of interest. In the DoD, we call them secure mission enclaves, but really all they are is hypersecure tunnels between users and applications. That's really what this is. Now, what really makes that cool is now we get into something called dynamic isolation. So in the DoD, in the US DoD, we used to call this adaptive response, dynamic network defense. Well, now on the commercial side, we're calling it dynamic isolation, because now when you have these granular hypersecure tunnels, now you have a conversation where you can actually isolate and quarantine suspected and vulnerable issue, or let's just say it this way. When you suspect something nefarious going on the network, on an isolated piece of the network, in a community of interest, in a secure mission enclave, you can dynamically isolate and quarantine that in real time. Now, why is that important? For those of you that do network for the pen testing crowd out there, you guys all know that if you're really smart about what you're doing, I'm not coming at you with stuff, right? With malware. No, why would I do that? Because I want to lay low and hide in your network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do things like PowerShell. I'm going to do things like I'm going to figure out what, through open source intelligence, you're doing with your own network. And so I'm going to use that operating system mojo against you, right? I'll live off the land. I'll use your own processes, your own tools against you. So that way, when you're scanning your network, you're not seeing anything you don't understand, anything you're afraid of. You're just seeing normal traffic on your network. I am hiding in your network, right? So you don't want to kill that when something weird starts happening. In fact, you want to keep it alive, because the minute you kill that, it goes away. You lose the ability to do the forensics. You're not able to learn from that and then inoculate the rest of the enterprise. So there's a lot of good conversations that come out of this, right? So the key is, right, and I will tell you, the companies that are scaling at big levels, they're not doing it with VPNs, right? In fact, they're using this conversation right now about enablement of a remote workforce to do something that we used to call extending the operational reach and access of a truly expeditionary and global remote workforce. That's what this is all about. Because what's going to happen is, and you guys and girls are reading about this right now, everyone's starting to realize. I'll give you an example. In Unisys, we spend over $100 million on real estate a year. Over $100 million on leases, parking, all that stuff, all the ancillary stuff that comes with a building and putting people in the building. Unisys went from having, I would say, maybe 5 to 10% of our workforce remote, right? So 80% of Unisys worked in an office. We spent over $100 million a year on things like leases and rent and all this other kind of stuff. In 2 weeks, when the global pandemic hit, we went to 95% of our entire company, 20,000 people, all fully remote in 2 weeks. No hiccups, no drop in performance, no nothing. The challenge, though, the problem to that, if you can call it a problem, because I'm a remote worker anyway, so I love it. But now leadership is having conversations about, why are we spending $100 million on real estate again? Because when we come out on the other side of the pandemic, if we can not have a drop in performance of the network, or the business model, not the network, but I mean the supported business model, if we don't suffer a drop in that, we could potentially come out of this now saving a lot of money, right? So these are the kind of conversations coming up, right? So now we're having conversations about how do you save, or how do you collapse virtual as well as physical footprint, right? So now the remote workforce drama actually becomes a business enablement conversation, right? The new normal, the new reality coming out of this is why haven't we been doing this? Which is a great point. So if you see, last month I sat down with Chase Cunningham from Forrester Research, and he has this great quote, and you'll see it if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see some stuff on LinkedIn about it, where he says, the world of 2025 that we've been talking about, it's here today, right? It just got fast forwarded to today. So you are absolutely able to scale at the levels needed, because we're doing it in our company. We're doing it with 20,000 people. 20,000 people. The U.S. government is doing it with much more people, and we're doing it securely. We're doing it at reduced cost, and we're doing it with much less complexity than having to manage, access control lists, firewall rule sets, and VPNs, right? Because why would you? Why would you do those? That's kind of an antiquated technology that doesn't pace with the current reality today. They're vulnerable. Everybody knows that, every time you add a firewall, you're bringing potential vulnerabilities into your network. You're actually physically inducing vulnerabilities into your network by bringing more hardware into the network. And oh, by the way, you're bringing more hardware into your network to fix problems for security. And by the way, most organizations today are spending 2/3 of their time and money trying to patch and maintain the very security devices that they brought in to fix the security holes that they had. When you start saying this out loud, it just sounds like sheer madness. Like, why would you do that, right? Well, up until today, up until the crisis, most organizations, they need to, have Newton, right? Jack didn't make this up. Newton's law of, an object's going to stay at rest until it gets a shove, right? Well, I'm here to tell you, Mother Nature has given us a freaking shove, right? And so if most organizations are reticent to move off the X and move into and adopt new disruptive type technology, change cultures, and embrace, a better way of doing business, there is no better emphasis right now than Mother Nature leaning on your shoulder saying, I'm knocking real freaking hard, you better pay attention, right? And so now, most organizations on the Unisys side of the house that we deal with, they will say one of two things. Jack, microsegmentation sounds fantastic. We got it, but we've invested a lot of time and money up until this point, and we really don't want to take that leap, even though we know it's the right thing to do, because we're either scared, afraid, or, to be quite frank, we need a breach or we need a merger and acquisition to cough up enough money for us to make that move. And we have now been presented with a golden opportunity. And I hate when I say it like that, because now I sound like a salesman, right? I am not a salesman, but what I am is a technology evangelist. And when I see people doing, now I won't say wrong, people are doing what they know to do because they've been trained to do it and they grew up in certain communities doing things, right? But things evolve, and what we're not talking about is evolution here. This is not an evolutionary conversation. This is a revolutionary conversation. This is literally a paradigm shift in the way we can present a network architecture and a security model so that we can now enable scale, we can now enable a globally distributed workforce, and at the same time, we can lower cost, we can lower complexity, and get all those things that the business SLT is really going to be needing. Because I'm telling you right now, you guys know that for the next year, most companies are going to be underwater and they're going to be hemorrhaging and they're going to be trying to figure out where they can cut corners, because it's going to be ugly on the balance sheet for the next year until we kind of get out on the other end of this thing. Now, I would love to talk more about this, but Mark and Sandy flat out told me, Jack, you got 30 minutes. And then we're going to shock collar you. And you can't see it right now, but I'm getting shock collared in my chair right now to shut up, because we want to make sure we have enough time to kind of really have some in-depth conversations, because I can chatter forever. That's not the point here. It's not about Jack talking. It's really about kind of teasing out and getting you guys and girls to kind of unpack some issues that you're dealing with so we can kind of have an intelligence conversation about that. So with that, thank you very much. I really appreciate you giving me the time here. Sandy, Mark, I'm going to turn it back over to you and take guidance from the tower, as they say.
Excellent, Jack. That is fantastic. And we do have a couple of questions for you, and I'd invite participants to send more questions in should they come up with some. The question I have, Jack, for you is, so we've talked in broad terms about this issue and remote workers. What would be really good is if you could give some examples of maybe how this would work for different sized businesses. So we've talked about a range of businesses, but how would this work for small businesses? How would it work for medium-sized businesses and large businesses? The other thing is maybe you can give a couple of examples of entities. So how would this work, for example, in health? Like health is a big issue at the moment with all the work going on in terms of trying to link, say, medical devices and connect them to the broader health system. How would it work, say, for banking and finance? and just critical infrastructure more broadly. So maybe you could give some examples, Jack.
Okay, great. So for those that have not been to a university setting before, what Mark just did was said, Jack, I have one question broken into 7 subsets, each with 4 parts to each of those subsets. So so what Mark did was he uncompressed the zip file, and I'm going to try and now zip that file back up real quick. So, long story short, the beauty of microsegmentation is that it's designed to do exactly what you just said, Mark. So whether you're an SMB, a small medium business, or a large enterprise, large global organization, microsegmentation is designed. It's inherently designed to do the dynamic and elastic conversation, very much so, like say AWS would do, right? I don't want to say it's a consumption model, but for example, a small business may only have a need to have one conversation, one critical workload, one critical application connected to one critical user. From there, you can scale out to the point where, and this is the magic, Mark, the magic is automation, right? So the companies that are doing this right, the companies that really have this code cracked, happy to have a conversation later about that, but the companies that are doing that have weaved in automation so that you have an automated engine that allows this thing to go. Because if you understand how network communication and telemetry works, it's not always on, right? In fact, you don't always want it on. What you want is the point of communication to be occurring as needed, and then it goes away. It's ephemeral, if you will. It's an ephemeral conversation, right? Because why do I want to be charged for stuff that I'm not using? I'm not doing that in the cloud. I only want to be charged for what I'm using. The same thing with the hypersecure tunnels. I want to stand up the tunnels as needed, and when no longer needed, they go away. That's the beauty of microsegmentation, because when it's done automated, for example, as your organization grows, the tunneling process grows as well. More importantly, imagine when a guy or girl joins a company, you have to do all the associations, you set up all their connections and relationships. But what happens is when they leave, a lot of times those access control lists and firewall rule sets, they don't get aged off or modified or updated. Those are now vulnerabilities that guys like me used to take advantage of, right? What you really want is you want that hypersecure tunnel that stands up so that when Mark and Sandy need to talk, it's hypersecure, it's up, it's ephemeral, it's running. But when Sandy goes away, either leaving the organization or drops off the network, that tunnel disappears. That's the magic. There are organizations that are doing that. Now, where, right? So this sets up really good conversations. So in the healthcare sector, in Unisys, we're working with some healthcare folks. In fact, it's a good segue because we just got off a call with one of them today, as a matter of fact. We have a lot of doctors that are being, there's no other way to say this, they're being protected. The hospital, the respiratory doctors are in the hospital, yes. But what people don't appreciate is the heart surgeons, the brain surgeons, they're being told don't come into the hospital. You have a very highly, very expensive skill set. We don't want you getting COVID-19. You stay at home. So now you have to figure out a way to enable the remote conversation of very sensitive things between a doctor and a patient and a doctor and the hospital with medical records, insurance records, so we don't induce insurance fraud. And now people are free to share their most intimate things with. Because think about it like this. If I share with my doctor that I have cancer, I don't want that getting out because that can be used against me. If, for example, an insurance company finds out about that, they may not choose to insure me. There's all kind of conversations that come up. That's why CIA of healthcare information is critical. That's why, and it's a great point you bring up, Mark, the healthcare sector, because they have probably one of the more stringent in terms of, and not only, I hate to say it, it's not even security, it's about compliance, regulatory, and audit checks. Because just because you're opening the floodgates to help people doesn't mean you're not going to get sued with a lawsuit after the COVID-19 crisis ends by some insurance company because they failed in a compliance check because of either GDPR, or here in the United States we have the California version of GDPR, and then down in Australia you have the same compliance things. So people aren't getting a get out of jail free card just because they've turned on everything to a VPN and the doctor is now talking with stuff at home, because someone's going to come 6 months later and go, you were letting all this PII data out during, COVID-19, and now it's loose in the wild, and it sets up all these other conversations. But hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that was great, Jack. We've had a few more questions come in while you've been answering that one. I guess one that's related, as I mentioned, in regards to just different industries. How can microsegmentation work with things such as SCADA systems and the Internet of Things?
Okay. What I'm doing right now is deep packet inspection because this one cuts near and dear to my heart. So I cut my teeth in what's called EP SCADA. So whoever asked that question, you'll know what that acronym means. So electrical power supervisory control and data acquisition, right? Right off the top of my head, right? So memory is still fresh, right? So trying to figure out how to exploit electrical power supervisory control and data acquisition, right? So of course the joke is everyone right now is probably Googling Stuxnet and they're Googling, Iranian centrifuges and all that other crap, right? Got it. But the point is, the way organizations do that is they use something called physical spacing, right? Physical segmentation. That's how you do it. Now, in my old job, we used to refer to as physical separation or physical segmentation, or I guess the term would be air gapping. We used to call that network latency because you can do that. You can pop that. You can exploit that. In fact, we're getting so good now. If you read some of the stuff that some of the cutting edge Israeli teams are doing, and I'm talking about Israeli teams on the research side. I am now out of the U.S. government. I am now in the commercial sector. So on the research side in Israel, doing some really fascinating work on not just exploiting against air gap systems, but actually exfilling data, right? So for example, if you've ever exploited a system, by the way, Mark, whoever asked this question, I'm sorry, now you've got me going here. So here's what happens. When you're going against a target, it's not just always moving forward. When you're trying to exploit against a target, you're trying to actually figure out two things. Who am I on the network and where am I on the network? In order to do that, there has to be some exfiltration of data so I can see, am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing against the right person? Who is this person? What processes am I able to touch here, right? So it's a two-way conversation. It's not just about getting in. There has to be telemetry coming out so I can course correct and actually, figure out where I'm going. Now, it's a feedback loop. Now, having said that, the SCADA systems, the operational technology world, the OT world, or the ICS world, industrial control system world, right? They were always seen as red-haired stepchildren over here. But now we've seen this bleed over from OT into IT, information technology. The target hack is a perfect example. I will compromise some contractor who works on HVAC systems, and when he works on the HVAC system for target, I will then get access to the target network, and I move my way down into the point of sale system, and next thing you know, I'm compromising credit cards in a Target shopping store. That's how this all works. Microsegmentation allows you to bypass, no pun intended, the requirement for physical separation and allows you to get into something what we refer to as cryptographic segmentation. So cryptographic segmentation, for those of you that play in this world for industrial control systems, you'll be familiar with the reference standard model known as ISA 99, the ISA 99. That is the guidance document that says if you are an energy provider, a water provider, critical infrastructure provider that's doing big things with little things, right, the industrial control systems, here's how you have to do it in order to pass compliance. And physical separation is one of those things, physical segregation. But they've now got wording in there that allows, through microsegmentation, because the state of the art has now advanced to the point where cryptographic segmentation can be used. So now guess what happens? You can actually now, perish the thought, hook your ICS system up to the internet. So now you can actually be a remote worker, not have to buy a lot of trucks to go out to a lot of sites, remote sites to check pumps and plumbing, right? You can do it from the comfort of your home. Now you're saving money. That is what microsegmentation is exactly designed to do, because remember, going back to what I said earlier, it's designed as a security mechanism. That's what it's designed to. And it's now being recognized by, the actual compliance and auditory folks, regulatory folks like ISA 99 for that very thing. Wow, I'm shutting up there. That was way too much for one question. So back over to you, Mark.
Yeah, great answer, Jack. Really well put. And we've had a flood of questions coming in. What I might do is just scan those. One of the ones that I thought was a good question is, and this is one we get within our business quite often, is Australia really a target of, hackers? So people think, we're probably a very small proportion of the world economy. Why would anybody be interested in Australia? Why do organisations in Australia need to invest in this sort of technology and approach to segmenting and hardening their network? Is it overkill?
Yeah. So let me give you why that's important. Australia may not be the target. but Australia may be part of the conversation to get to the target, right? So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an analogy. If I wanted to go after a person, a lot of times, if I'm trying to track people, a lot of times it would be easier to figure out places that they go to. So for example, what if I gained access to a hotel and I knew that hotel, unlike in the United States, like in the United States, you can check into a hotel, and I'm not sure exactly what the rules are, but just follow the analogy. In the United States, you can check into a hotel, but in a lot of countries, like in Europe, I used to live in Europe for almost 10 years. In a lot of countries, when you check into a hotel, just spend the night, you got to show them your passport, and they record that passport information. Do you think that they do that with pen and paper? No, they do that electronically. So instead of chasing a bunch of people to track their movement, wouldn't it be a lot easier just to pop the hotel? Why? Because the hotel tends to sit on a lot of information. And oh, by the way, the hotel doesn't have the security that a lot of people does, because it's a hotel. Why would they, right? All of a sudden now, the hotel was not the target, but they were simply a point of presence on the journey towards getting to the ultimate target. And by the way, it's a lot easier because, right, they're a hotel. Now, I'm not saying Australia is a hotel, but I will say that Australia, because of its proximity to certain areas of interest in the world, right? For example, China, right? There is a large influx of people, equipment, things that come through there. And so in a globally connected world where supply chains are intermingled, for example, if you want to pop, I'll give you an example, even better example. If I'm going after a large multinational company based in the United States that makes billions with a B dollars and has a worldwide footprint, do you think I'm going to attack them in the United States? No. I will tell you, speaking from experience, that it's much easier to do a business email compromise of a business executive in Australia, compromise them through phishing, and then use that now corrupted credential, i.e. the identity of that individual, to send an email inside of now the network that I'm part of back to the United States to move funds. So again, this balkanization conversation, which is to say, I'm in Australia, I'm not really part of the conversation, what's the big deal? I'm here to tell you, I will bring you into the conversation very, very quickly. I will collapse borders very, very quickly. As they say in cyberspace, there is no such thing as a border. And if we continue to look at the world like we look at a map, like we look at a globe, we will continue to lose, because the smart people don't look at nation states. They don't look at borders and they don't look at maps. They see bits and digits. And as everybody knows, when I send an email from point A to point B, it doesn't go to the fastest way. It goes to the most economical way. And when people start to realize that it may take a longer route, but it's actually cheaper for the bits and digits to get from point A to point B, it starts to make sense to them. There is no such thing as Australia in cyberspace, if you understand where I'm going with this. Does that make sense? I got really meta there for a minute. You got to bring me back to earth.
Yeah, no, it's great, Jack, and very important that we, we consider those things. People still think in terms of borders, but it's bigger issues at play here. I've got an excellent question that's come in here, and I'll probably get to all of these questions, but this is one that I think it requires immediate attention. That is, during the pandemic, have you witnessed any increase in the threat to energy providers? Given that we can't afford for the lights to go out, so to speak, have you seen an increase in the threat to this highly important sector? And I guess you could extrapolate that sort of more broadly to those sort of critical infrastructure type entities. Are they a target? Have you seen targeting in this area? Why would somebody target that area, and what would be the implications maybe?
Yeah, so that problem is, as a technology guy, as a geek, right? My favorite go-to answer when posed with a challenging question is, it depends, right? That's my get out of jail free card. But the reason why in this particular case that's relevant and pertinent is that it's really, we have to unpack that question. Is the fact that we're seeing, if we are seeing more things on the network, right? More network anomalies, more as we say, you don't see a black hole, you just see the disturbance around it in the space, right? The effects on gravity around a black hole. That's how we discovered them in the first place. But is it due, in fact, to an increased outside pressure or extra interest on the particular target set? In this case, electrical power or water or production facilities? Or is it simply because the security teams are on hyper awareness and hyper vigilance because a lot of the people are working from home? There's this increased awareness that, everyone's coming in through VPNs, right? So I don't know if the answer is yes, because the adversaries are now looking at that, or is the answer yes, because we are paying more attention to our stuff now because we're scared and therefore we're seeing more stuff. Do you see what I'm saying by that?
Yeah, Jack, that's great. Thank you.
I will tell you. So pausing there, I will tell you that the big fear right now is not that we're seeing extra interest on the grids, if you will, the pumping stations, the production facilities. That's not the big fear right now. The big fear is all of the telemetry that we're missing that's now inside, right? That's the fear, because most organizations, they can't chew bubblegum and walk at the same time. They do one of two things really well. They either watch the perimeter very well, or they watch everything on the inside very well. Very few organizations can watch the perimeter and watch what's going on inside. And so the problem is, and this is why it's, you guys know this, right? This is why the M&M analogy is always fun to talk about. Crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, right? If you pop the VPN or if you get in somewhere, once you're in, and now you've got dwell time and you're looking around, right? Again, this is great because back to microsegmentation. With microsegmentation, there is no perimeter. Everything's like this. There is no in to get into. Every bite is hard and crunchy. Every time the adversary takes a bite, they are raising their signature and working harder because they're in a microsegmentation world. It's like a roach motel. They check in, but they can't check out, and they can't see what's around them. So now they have to, if you've ever done this before, you've got to ask yourself, well, do I work extra hard, take an extra hard bite, thereby raising my signature and identifying myself, or do I simply go to another target, right? And so that's the challenge right now. So, the answer is I just don't know. I don't know if the increased activity is due to us watching or if it's due to external pressures. I will tell you though, knowing what I know about us, we would never let any opportunity slip away. And so if there was an opportunity to ride in on the coattails of some current event, we would do so. So why not other people?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. What I might do now is just kind of string together a couple of questions, Jack. One person asked that they understand the impact on the bottom line. You've been very good at explaining that and the different kind of potential models, I guess, for businesses operating. But what's the cost differences, say, from micro-segmentation and comparing that to VPNs and firewalls? And I'll also add IPS and IDS, so intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. If organizations already have those sorts of systems in place, what's the kind of cost differential? And I know you touched on, adding security devices kind of adds to the complexity of the network, and then you've got to maintain them and so forth. But in terms of order of magnitude, are we looking at a massive additional cost, or maybe less cost, in moving away from some of those existing technologies, or even kind of considering how do those technologies coexist with a micro-segmented model?
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So we're going to need to unpack that one. So cost means many things. Everyone wants the bottom line, but what is the bottom line, right? So there's hardware costs, there are people costs, there is time costs, and then a lot of people don't fully appreciate, right? So people in the security world, a lot of us, and I freely I admit, I grew up like this too, right? When you grow up as a security person, or as me, a pirate, anti-security, right? So pirate, to us, security is like a bubble, right? But security doesn't exist in and of itself to support itself. So security is there to do one thing, and that is support the underlying business model. That's it. The business dies, security goes away, right? We're all going out of a job. So cost, right? What is the business not able to do because they're spending X amount of dollars on security, right? That's a component nobody ever talks about, right? I can tell you, oh, how many pieces of hardware do we have? Firewalls, what flavor of firewall, the operating system licenses, IDSs, IPSs, sensors, switches, boxes, all the hardware stuff. Yeah, I can give you a number of that. How many people does it take to manage that? Well, all of those people cost how much? That's another number, right? But what's really lost in the conversation is, what are all those people not doing that they could be doing if they didn't have to do this other stuff, right? Are there other things that really, and that is, speed to market. Where's the business trying to go? Or in the case of a government, what service is the government trying to provide that it can't because it's got people tied down and money tied down doing this other stuff? Those are hidden costs that nobody ever talks about, right? So it makes it very difficult to talk about. But what I can say is orders of magnitude. I'll give you an example. So in our particular case, and I will whitewash this, but in our particular case, we had probably one of the most complex states in the United States. They said, we got to stop what we're doing. This way of doing stuff with traditional hardware, the firewalls, the VPNs, all this other stuff to do security, protection, networks, and all this stuff. We got to get away from that. We need to save some money. And so by using something called microsegmentation and the stuff that we do, we were able to take them down. And here's the metrics, and I'll leave it to you to figure out what that monetary cost would be. We took them from 52 data centers, managed data centers, down to 1. Everything that they were doing, the same security, actually increased security, same compliance, same audit, same regulatory oversight. And this is a state, so you've got all the extra, rules and regulations of what you can do to do, authority to operate on network. Took them from 52 to 1 data center because of the use of what's called cryptographic segmentation. Now, what did that really mean? People were like, okay, so that's a huge cost savings, Jack. And I said, yeah, wait, it gets better. The firewall rule sets and access control lists that were managing those 52 data centers, over 5 million lines of code. 5 million lines of code. Imagine how many guys and girls had to spend every day just making sure that thing worked. So every time somebody came and went, all those things, everything got plugged and played, changed it, right? We took that down to 1,000. We went from over 5 million individual lines of code down to 1,000 secure communities of interest. That is order of magnitude savings in terms of cost, complexity, time, and oh, by the way, nobody loses a job, right? Everyone now gets to work on all the other priorities that they couldn't work on before. And so now guess what happened? The security people, they went from being the naysayers and the doomsayers to being the heroes, because now they're the ones making the organization go leaner, meaner, faster, further, and more secure. A completely different conversation. So, right, that's just but one example. This one is publicly acknowledged. You can Google this one. This is really good. In the case of the United States Department of Homeland Security Transportation Security Agency, we have about 400 to 500 airports in the United States, a witch's brew of networks, most of which not designed to talk to each other. Everything from scanners to kiosks to body imagers, everything that you touch and watches you and you interface with when you hit an airport, multiplied times 500 airports in the United States. The TSA said, we want to connect all this stuff so that way we can secure it. And more importantly, we can start doing things with that telemetry, right? We can learn from it. We can inform machine learning and early stage artificial intelligence to start kind of doing some inference modeling with that. But we need a way to secure it and connect it. So how do we do that? Our competitor said, hey, we'll do it for you. It'll cost $180 million. Unisys said, why would you do that? If you use microsegmentation and what we do, we can do it for about $30 to $40 million. It literally caused so many people to say, how did you go from $150 million to $30 to $40 million? You just can't do that. You're missing zeros on that, right? They actually took us to court, and the reason I can talk about this is because if you Google Unisys and TSA, you'll see the results of that. They took us to court. We had to show them how to do it. We won the contract. We now got that contract $250 million over 5 years. It's all public knowledge because it's orders of magnitude savings. But literally, now those are two extreme cases. For most organizations, you're not going to go in there and rip and replace. right, to achieve those kind of scales of cost savings. You're not going to rip and replace, because why would you? Any CISO that either gets a 3 to 5 year plan, gets the money and executes it, or my favorite saying is, I'm inheriting and executing on my predecessor's plan. That's their get out of jail free card, right? The point is, they're not getting any more money for it. So really what you want is a way to have a conversation where you can introduce the concepts of microsegmentation, which, by the way, are tied directly to zero trust networking models and all of that kind of good stuff, software defined perimeters, right? So you're now moving into that new reality, that new world, right? But you want to do it small and tactical, so that way, as the old model, the old 3 to 5 year plan comes up for refreshing and you got to buy new firewalls, you don't have to buy new firewalls. You age them off. They're being aged off. And then they're being subsumed by the hypersecure tunnels until eventually you now have this kind of pacing plan. So now it's not rip and replace, it's a placing plan where you're now embracing the future, or as we say, I'm a space geek. So as we say in Latin, ad astra, we're now to the stars, right? That's where you want to go. That's the conversation for cost savings. I'm sorry, very long-winded, but back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I might take one more question, and again, I'll try to combine some of the themes in the questions into this one question. Sorry if you've got to unpack it a bit, but it just gives us an opportunity to cover off the remaining questions with the time left. So one person asked kind of like, what's the next steps for an organisation? Related to that, somebody asked if this is implemented through Active Directory, and another person asked, is this the sort of thing that Unisys offer proof of concept for, say, if an organisation did want to go down that track? So I kind of grouped those questions together in, what would be the next step for most organisations if they wanted to go down this track?
Yeah, so this is why they added the technology evangelist to my job title, right? Because a lot of what this is, I don't know how many Catholics are out there. I am married to a Catholic girl. And so I love the story of the Jesuit priests, where in the old days, they would literally have to go to an island by themselves, and they couldn't even talk the religion of microsegmentation. First, you had to teach the natives how to read and write. Then they had to build a church and a school. And then, and only then, could you teach them the religion of cybersecurity. And oh, by the way, the whole time you're trying not to be eaten by the cannibals, because at the same time, if they don't like what you're saying, they're going to eat you, right? It's kind of how I feel, right? So what are the next steps? Obviously, every organization is going to be different, but what we've seen is the theme, because we've been doing this. So I've been with the company 3 years now. Microsegmentation is a relatively new term. Zero trust is a relatively new term. There is no zero trust capability. There is no zero trust tool. That's all BS. If someone tries to sell you zero trust tool, don't listen to them. But because what it is it's a philosophical conversation. It's an understanding. It's a different culture approach to the way you present your network model. All right. And so obviously you're not going to go in there and just do, a binary, all or none, we're up or down, where one day we're traditional hardware, the next day we're microsegmentation. No, you're not going to do that. The reason why you don't do that is because if you understand what microsegmentation truly is, done wrong, microsegmentation will shut down a network, right? This is serious stuff, right? Because the first thing you have to do is you have to understand, you have to have visibility. You have to truly understand what your network is. So one, you want to work with a company that is not going to come in and sell you a tool or capability and just say, here it is, and have fun. You need a company that has the experience that's going to come in and say, stop, before we get to microsegmentation, let's take a look at your network. Let's understand what is on your network, what's talking to what on your network, and who should be talking to what on your network. That's step one. If you're not there, we need to have that conversation first. Most organizations they're only at about the 70% solution with that, right? We need to get them closer to 100, right? So that's the first thing, right? So start small, pick a critical application, a critical user, build that hypersecure tunnel, build that relationship. Then you're able to see who's talking to what, and then you confirm or deny. Should this be talking to this? Should it not? If it is, great. Another candidate, lock it down. Now the key is you're not going to do that as slow as I just said it, right? Because there's an automated way to do this, right? There's an inference engine that will go out, pull that rich telemetry in, make the recommendation, present that recommendation back on the dashboard to you saying, here's what right looks like, here's what's going on in your network. Most of the time, people forget to even talk about microsegmentation because they're so enamored with just having true visibility for the first time. They go, I had no idea that talk was happening on my network. I need to explore that more. But once we get past that, then we start to lock things down. That's what right looks like. That's how you start what I call the journey. That's the journey of microsegmentation. And then what typically happens is it kind of takes off from there. When we start doing it right, if you Google a term, the term is called identity-based software-defined encrypted microsegmentation. It's a mouthful, but as you mentioned, does this work with Active Directory? That's the key to true, real, dynamic microsegmentation. It's got to be identity-based. If you're working in an IP-based world where everything is rules-based and IP tables and worked on physical location and IP-based stuff, routing tables, that's old school. You're outdated. It needs to be identity-based, going back to the original reason, right? When you're working at the scales and the distances in today's global remote workforce, you can't be reliant on knowing an IP address because they change. It has to be identity-based. The user comes in. And when identity is coupled with microsegmentation, even if the user identity is shanghaied in a bar and his credentials are compromised and he uses, because he's on Active Directory, assigned to a role, he effectively only drops into the smallest, most narrow piece of your network and he can't get out of it. Right? So now, if he or she, the bad person, starts doing bad things in that very small piece of your network, they start trying to look around, try and move around, do stuff. Those things trigger things, and now you're able to lock down and isolate that piece of thing. You see how this conversation, we're no longer even talking about things like a SOC or a SIM, where you're just doing static monitoring and detecting. We're talking about true fusion centers with dynamic response, where you're actually able to monitor, detect, and respond. And it's now we're having conversations like the human body where we're actually going, okay, I'm sick, but the rest of the critical infrastructure is still protected and we're moving out and doing what we got to do, right? There are organizations that are doing this and thinking like this already. And I'm telling you right now, that's the true competitive advantage right now. Going forward, post-pandemic, that's the competitive advantage because organizations are learning how to do it and they're embracing it right now. So yes, it is tied to identity. It is tied to Active Directory, but not limited to Active Directory. It could be whatever form of identity management system you're using. In the military or in the federal government, you're using credentials, right? So it could be a common access card, right? It could be LDAP, whatever flavor of LDAP you're using. It could be Active Directory, right? But the answer is not Active Directory. The answer is identity. But you're tracking. That's the key. So, yeah, again, a lot to unpack there, but back over to you.